The path of love, living poverty, chastity, and obedience in the Salesian Spirit. My dear friends, today we reflect on three treasures often misunderstood: poverty, chastity, and obedience. In a world that prizes wealth, pleasure, and independence, these counsels may seem restrictive. Yet, through the wisdom of St. Francis de Sales, we discover that they are not chains but keys that unlock freedom, joy, and intimacy with God. For him, these counsels are not reserved for religious alone. They are practical pathways of love that purify every Christian heart. The first point for our reflection today: poverty, liberating the heart of God's love. Salvation poverty is not misery but spiritual richness. It is about holding material things lightly and treasuring God above all. St. Francis de Sales reminds us: have riches in your house or purse, but not in your heart. He speaks of few things like simplicity, living uncluttered lives that focus on what matters most; detachment, treating possessions as gifts to be used responsibly and shared generously; moderation, avoiding both indulgence and deprivation, seeking balance; sharing, generosity that builds solidarity with the poor; trust in providence, relying on God's loving care with serenity. Fruits of poverty. Poverty purifies the heart, strengthens relationships, and frees us from the slavery of consumerism. To love poverty is to discover true joy and freedom. The second point for reflection today is chastity, unveiling the beauty of divine love. Chastity is often misunderstood as repression, but for St. Francis de Sales, it is the lily of virtues, a virtue of purity, fidelity, and freedom. Unlike celibacy, which refers only to a state of life, chastity applies to everyone, married, single, or consecrated. He speaks of few things like love for God, offering one's heart and body to God as a gift; love for others, enabling us to love with freedom, fidelity, and generosity, whether in marriage or consecrated life; self love, respecting our dignity as children of God. Fruits of chastity. Chastity requires prayer, sacraments, self control, and guidance. It integrates our desires into love that is authentic and life giving. The fruits are deep relationships, emotional maturity, and holiness. The third point for our reflection today is obedience, freedom in God's will. Perhaps the hardest counsel to embrace is obedience. In a world that idolizes autonomy, obedience seems stifling. Yet, St. Francis de Sales teaches that true obedience is an act of love. All must be done through love, nothing through constraint, says St. Francis de Sales. Obedience means listening attentively and aligning our will with God's. It is not passive submission, but discerning surrender. A few things that St. Francis de Sales speaks of here is necessary obedience to church and legitimate authority; voluntary obedience to spiritual directors and vows; perfect obedience, choosing God's will even in difficulty. Fruits of obedience. This paradox holds: our will is never so free as when it rests in God's. Obedience liberates us from pride, ego, and fear, teaching humility and peace. The fourth point for reflection today is the vows, a love response to God. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience are not rules but invitations, responses of love to God's call. They echo Christ's own self-emptying life and root us in gospel. St. Francis de Sales insists that these are vows of love above all. Religious life, he says, is essentially a love response where love overweighs every other practice. These vows purify, intensify, and focus our love so that it becomes disinterested, seeking nothing but God's glory. When lived authentically, the vows transform the individual into a freer, more joyful disciple, the community into a sign of Christ's presence, the world into a place touched by witness, service, and hope. The vows are counter-cultural reminders that true holiness lies not in wealth, pleasure, or control, but in love, service, and surrender. The fifth point for our reflection today is living the vows the Salesian way. For St. Francis de Sales, these counsels must be lived with gentleness and humility. He encouraged his followers to practice the little virtues: kindness, patience, humility, and cheerfulness. These transform the vows from heavy burdens into joyful ways of living. Salesian spirituality is not about extraordinary fears, but about fidelity in ordinary life. Poverty is lived in simplicity, chastity in authentic love, and obedience in gentle surrender. In this way, consecrated persons and lay Christians alike can echo the motto of St. Francis de Sales, "Live Jesus." To conclude, a life ablaze with love. My dear friends, when seen through the Salesian lens, poverty, chastity, and obedience are not restrictions, but liberations. They free us from attachment, ego, and self-seeking, and they opens us to joy, peace, and communion with God. St. Paul's words capture the heart of these vows. I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. May we live this path of love with courage, generosity, and joy, so that our lives become beacons of God's transforming love in the world. Live Jesus.